On a reverse chairs and reverse roles, so I get to ask the questions this time. I'm more comfortable over here than I was answering them. And for those who might see this interview years from now, might not realize what dear friends we've been and for how long we've had that relationship. So I feel like I'm interviewing my brother, even though we grew up in different places. Anyway, I wonder if you could tell us, Steve, a little about growing up in the seacoast of New Hampshire.
Sure.
Was that in the 30s? I can't remember.
It was in the 30s, in the 1830s. I'm not sure that this will ever be seen, my section of it. I think yours will be, but I wouldn't want to be interviewed by anybody else than John Broderick, who's had the most profound influence on my career. My father was a lumberman in Hampton, New Hampshire, and I grew up in the seacoast there. And my mom stayed at home until she actually went to work to earn money so that I could go to the university, which was a pretty humbling experience. There were 144 kids in my high school class. I graduated very close to first. I was number 72. So I was exactly in the middle, as many above me as beneath me. And yet when I graduated from the University of New Hampshire, the only school I applied to, I was Phi Beta Kappa, magna cum laude, a Ford Foundation scholar. Something happened. I think there were two things that happened. Number one, the smart kids drank, and I didn't drink. And therefore, the National Honor Society kids who thought they didn't have to study, didn't study. And I thought, this is my only chance. I'm probably going to go back and work in a lumber company if I don't hit this. So I studied like crazy. Didn't study in high school, had a wonderful time. Studied like crazy in college. And all of a sudden, I was able to fulfill my lifetime dream. You and I both decided to become lawyers in the 7th grade. I actually put it in my junior high yearbook that I wanted to be a lawyer.
What caused that?
There was a show called, Jim McKay was on television, and it was a courtroom show in which I think it was called Your Day in Court. And I would come home in the afternoon and watch lawyers cross-examine people, and I said, that's what I got to do. Of all the exciting things I've done in my life, standing in front of juries, looking them in the eye, and trying to convince them to go in a particular direction, it was the best.
Tell me about Hampton, growing up there in the 50s. What was it like?
It was a small town, 10,000 in the winter and 100,000 in the summer. Neither of my parents went to college. So, I mean, for me to go on and be the Attorney General and the Governor, it's sort of an American experience. It shows me that ordinary people like me in America can get the opportunity to do extraordinary things. And with all due respect, your life is very much the same. You've gone on to do things you never dreamed. I've gone on to do things I never dreamed. I was not one of those people that calculated when I was in Hampton, I'm going to do this and that's going to help me to get to this place in my life. I was always open to three things. I wanted to work hard, I wanted to have fun, and I wanted to see where that would take me.
Let me ask you something, because a lot of people watching might not realize this, but you're actually you have a fabulous voice, and you're very good with the guitar. And I know in college at UNH you would sing in coffee houses. When did you start to play, and how did that evolve?
It's interesting. I didn't use this as the Republican candidate for governor a lot, but I did work my way through college playing and singing in coffee houses. I got caught up by Bob Dylan, who I thought was the most amazing songwriter. And I bought a guitar and a harmonica, and I started singing in my high school. And then at UNH, I would go down to a place called the New World Gallery in Portsmouth, and I would perform. And sometimes I would get asked by rock bands to go and sing with them for the weekend to make a little bit of extra money. So I not only loved the artistry of it, however that should be defined, but I made money at it, so it was really good.
When did you know you were funny? You were a very funny person.
I knew I was funny when I could make my mother laugh, and I did that often. My mother and I had a very close relationship, as you know.
Yes.
But when I made her laugh, I thought, I'm probably going to make other people laugh. And so in high school, while others were studying, I remember my idea of studying was I used to turn the television on, I used to turn the radio on, and I'd sit at the edge of my bed and do the homework. Probably not a classic way to do well, but I was always funny enough so that the teachers were nice to me, didn't kick me out of class even though they should have. And it's always, having a sense of humor about yourself is so important.
Yes, it is important. It is
Because
important.
life has all kinds of issues, and you better be able to laugh, because if you can't.
Yeah, so when I knew your mom, obviously, I thought your mother was this very special person, always gracious to me. I remember the night, years later, she was elderly, and we were over at your house, and she wanted to see the ball drop on New Year's Eve. Remember that? It was kind of unkind.
Yes.
And we were both exhausted, and we decided we'd move the clock ahead.
That's right.
So it's only 11, but we said it was 12. And she said, turn on the TV.
Yeah.
And there was no dissuading her. She was...
Oh, she was so disgusted with us for going to bed before midnight. It was crazy. You wanted to go home, and I just wanted to go upstairs. And that was the kind of relationship I had with my mom.
Tell me about your mother when you were at UNH, because I know how devoted you were to her and she to you, and what she was doing to make that possible.
Yeah, she went back to work. She hadn't worked for over 20 years. She went back to work in a place called Colt's News Store in Hampton, and saved her tips. Getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, going to work behind a soda fountain, having been one of the more prominent women. Her husband owned a big lumber company in Hampton. She really humbled herself in a way to do that, and I found out later that she gave me the money that she had been saving, and she said, this will help you at the University of New Hampshire. And I said, I can't take that money. And she said, no, you have to take the money. It's going to make it easier for you to work your way through. And I honestly think, John, that's one of the reasons I didn't drink and I didn't fool around. I felt, this is a serious commitment she's made to me. I better make that same kind of commitment. And honestly, at the university, my mom came and visited me a lot. We were close pals till the end, as you know. And the National Honor Society students actually started getting in trouble and flunking out by the sophomore year. And my goal was just to make the dean's list once in 4 years. And I made it the first semester, and then I said, well, maybe I can actually do this. And it doesn't matter whether you're smart or not. It matters whether you're smart in relation to everybody else that's taking the exams. And if they were drinking and fooling around and I was studying, I figured, hey, I'll work hard, I'll make this.
And what did you major in at UNH?
I majored in history. And I almost became, because I was a Ford Foundation scholar, they wanted me to become a history professor. And I almost did it. But then I got accepted at Georgetown Law School. And I said...
Was that accredited when they...
It was not accredited, really. It was fairly close.
It was on the cusp.
Yes. You and I have had a rivalry between the University of Virginia and Georgetown Law School. And the sad part was, at Divine Millimet, when we would interview, the University of Virginia students always interviewed better than the Georgetown students, which I hate to say.
And of course, only one of us was shocked by that.
That's right.
I still recall.
That's right. But to give you an idea of what my life was like, I had never visited the campus at Georgetown. I thought the law school was on the main campus. It's actually way down. It was at 6th and E in those days, in a very difficult part of town. I had so little money that I slept on a mattress on a floor with 7 other guys in a house.
Did you know anyone before you went
Didn't know
there?
anybody there. No. And when I got there and found out, how naive could I have been? I found out that it wasn't on the main campus. I drove down past the law school. I said, oh my gosh, what have I done? I can't believe that I was that naive about it. But I just assumed Georgetown had to be one of the best schools in America, so of course it's going to be prestigious. Well, the teachers were great and the academic standards were great, but the physical plant in those days, now they've moved,
yes.
And it's a lovely campus, but it was tough. I went from a big fish in a small pond to a very big pond, and I wasn't sure I was going to make it through law school.
Now, you were in a class time. There was somebody from New Hampshire.
Yeah, Jim Hood.
Yes.
Jim Hood, who practices in Manchester. I was the cadet colonel of Air Force ROTC, and he was the cadet colonel of Army ROTC. And Jim and I became friends and helped each other in study groups. And yeah, he's a wonderful guy.
Were you on a journal down at Georgetown?
I was on the Georgetown Law Journal, and when I got ready to, I didn't know what I wanted to do. Actually, John, I did. I wanted to go to the big city and be a big city criminal lawyer until I saw the big city and the big city criminals. Then I decided I needed to do something else with my life. And I had an Air Force commitment, and someone said, are you going to go in the JAG Corps? And I said, yes, I am. And they said, well, you should apply to the General Counsel's office. So I didn't even know what that was, but I applied and was accepted, and I became an attorney for the Secretary of the Air Force in the Pentagon. So during the Vietnam War era, when it wasn't popular to be in the military, and it wasn't particularly popular to be in the Pentagon, but for me, a kid from Hampton, New Hampshire, when I went to the Pentagon and started working with generals and assistant secretaries, it changed my whole life. It changed my whole perspective.
Now, how old would you have been, Steve, at that time?
Oh, 25 probably.
Wow.
And one trip we took was Andrews Air Force Base. We were on Air Force 4, one of the president's planes. We went from Andrews to England, from England to Germany, from Germany to Turkey, from Turkey to Greece, back to Spain, and then back to Andrews. And I got to tell you about a case that I tried. It was one of my great moments. Because I was the personnel lawyer, I did a lot of work defending people before they got into the civil court system. I would handle the military appeal, and I was winning a lot of cases. So I was pretty confident that I was a pretty good lawyer and able to do my job well. In Ankara, Turkey, I was brought to plead a case for an Air Force enlisted man who had made a very bad decision. He went to Germany and bought drugs and came back to Turkey to sell them. They caught him at the border. He had lost 60 pounds in the Turkish prison before I got there to argue his appeal. And I was given 20 minutes to argue in front of a 3-judge panel, but if I needed more time, I could take it. And about a minute into my argument, the chief judge said, "Excuse me, young man," which I didn't think was a good sign. "Do you have any evidence that we treat Turkish prisoners differently than we treat this American prisoner?" And I said, "No, I don't, Your Honor." And he said, "Next case." I was done. The assistant secretary was sitting watching me. He said, "That was impressive. You flew 6,500 miles. You didn't even get to present anything." I said, "I'm done. That's it." So, one of my finer moments.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's the first I've ever heard of this. And now I understand why. Then.
Yeah, we're going to cut this out of the tape. There's no question.
Tell me something. I have it in my head that you worked for a while on the dark side with Senator McIntyre, Democratic.
Oh, I did.
U.S. Senator. What was that?
That was interesting. My dad was a Rockwood Republican, and when I went down there, I interviewed with Louis Wyman, who was the Republican congressman. And I wanted to be in law school and take advantage of the Georgetown, Washington, D.C. experience. And Louis said, "I don't have any jobs, but I'm going to call Tom McIntyre and I'm going to see if he'll give you a job." And I went over and interviewed, and he said, "Well, I'd like a Republican. I'm elected by Republicans when you think about it, because there were more Republicans then than Democrats in the state. And I'd like to have you come to work for me." So I was elated, called my father, who was just furious. And I said, "Well, let's see what happens." But the senator was always very nice to me, and working in the Senate for the second and third year of my law school, it was a great experience.
And when you got through at the Secretary of the Air Force, you decided to come home again.
I did. I would not have done it if my mom hadn't lived in Hampton. She was by herself then. And I thought, I'm going to come back. I took a job in Manchester, New Hampshire with the firm that you were in, Devine, Millamette, Stahl and Branch. The amazing part of that is I had only been to Manchester, New Hampshire twice in my life. Once to pick up a tuxedo for the prom with a buddy of mine, and because I lived in Hampton and my mother was from Massachusetts, we always went to Haverhill, Amesbury, the Peabody Mall, or Boston. So we always were buying in Massachusetts and always saw ourselves as able to go to the big city. Manchester was not a big city, but when I was working for Tom McIntyre, I met a man named Norman Stahl, who was retired from the First Circuit Court of Appeals. And Norman said, "You should come and try our firm in Manchester, because if you want to be a trial lawyer, Devine Millamette will give you more experience quicker than any of the other firms."
Pretty good advice.
And when I got there, I found out that was true. And in fact, Jim Hood and others, Jim was at the McLean firm at the time, and others said to me, "If you really want to try cases, you want to be on your own, you want to be that guy in front of the jury, you go to Devine Millamette and they'll give you cases right away." And that's what happened.
And you might have been, Steve, at the time. You joined there in '78.
Yes.
You might have been the first lateral hire. I think you might have been.
I was the first lateral hire, and that had both positives and negatives, because there were some people there who said, "Why should this guy come in from the Pentagon?" I didn't think I was a big deal, but I was afraid that some of them thought, this guy's going to try to come in and get an advantage. I actually was at a disadvantage because I had never practiced in the civil system, only the military system. And so I wanted to make sure, using my earlier experiences, which is if I work hard, maybe I can beat them. I'll be diligent, and Joe Millimet became one of my mentors. He soon turned me over to Bart Branch. And just as Matt Reynolds was your mentor, Bart Branch was my mentor. He was a dear friend of mine as well as a mentor. I hope that still happens in the New Hampshire bar. He looked after me. He wanted to know, where was I living? What was I doing? What was my personal life like? Was I happy? In those days, those relationships were very dear because you and I were just starting to try our first jury cases. And of course, I worked with you, which was a life-changing experience. I worked with Dick Galway, who I also was able to put on the court when I was governor. But I was thinking this morning that this tells you a lot about the New Hampshire bar. My first jury trial was against Freddie Catalfo in the Stratford County Superior Court. Freddie was a very wary, clever lawyer.
You wore velour suits.
He wore he had red and blue velvet velour suits on although he was Italian, obviously, on St. Patrick's Day, he wore a green suit with a green shirt and a green tie and green socks and green shoes. So I remember that was a classic day. And I represented a teenager who had smashed into the rear of a poor woman who was stopped at a stop sign going to work. And it was the middle of the winter, and I argued frozen brakes. And it was all I had. I argued frozen brakes. And
you would have argued that in the summer.
I would have. Believe me, the facts were not important. I needed to get this over with. And Freddie mopped up the floor with me. He was very kind and gracious, but he knew what he was doing, and I did not. And I think he ended up asking for too much money. I remember in his closing argument, he slammed his fist down on the jury rail, and one of his cufflinks popped off. And he said, "Don't let this slick young guy from Manchester in a nice suit come over here." I was better dressed than I thought, I guess. And the jury came back and wouldn't give him a verdict. They came back hung. And for me, that was an incredible victory. But what was interesting about it, by the time I got back to Divine Millimet, now there were no cell phones, no Blackberries. Everybody at Divine Millimet knew that the jury refused to give a verdict for Freddie because Freddie had called Mike McDonough and said, "That young guy you sent over here today beat the tar out of me." And he didn't say tar, but Freddie and I have been friends ever since. I thought, what a nice gesture for an older, more experienced lawyer to do that to a kid in his first jury trial.
I think, Steve, it wasn't the norm then, but it was far more common.
Yeah.
You know, they were trying to advance your career if they thought it was valuable to do that. Let me ask you this. When you were at Divine, you quickly became pretty well known, and not just because you were from New Hampshire. You were getting involved in the Sununu administration. How did that come about, and where did that take you?
It's interesting. I had decided, John Sununu became a client of the office and a friend of Norman Stahl's. An unlikely duo when you think about it, a prominent Jewish lawyer and a prominent Lebanese businessman. But in fact, I should tell you this story. But until the day he died, my father insisted that John Sununu was Finnish, and his family had come from Finland. And when I got to know John Sununu, I said, "You know, there's a lot of people in the state that think you're Finnish. How did that ever get started?" And Sununu said, "I started it." That was kind of clever. When I was at Divine, I decided I wanted to be a medical malpractice lawyer. So I was really devoting my time to working with Don Dufresne and trying medical malpractice cases. And at one point, John Sununu showed up, and Norman said, "I want you to meet a man who's going to run for governor." I didn't think that John Sununu was going to win. He had run for offices before and not won. And Norman said, "You're wrong, Stephen. If Governor Gallon gets into economic trouble, they might elect a guy from MIT who speaks 7 languages and is a member of Mensa." And I worked on a case. Governor Meldrum Thompson, a very colorful Republican conservative, probably the guy who started the conservative movement here in New Hampshire in the modern sense, he ran as an independent in the primary. And when he lost, he wanted to get his name off the ballot. Well, New Hampshire had just passed a statute that said you couldn't do that. But John Sununu wanted to bring the case, largely because I think he wanted the publicity of having Mel Thompson say repeatedly in the press, "I don't want to be on the ballot. Basically, don't vote for me, because if you do, Governor Gallon's going to win. John Sununu isn't going to beat him." there were several prominent lawyers. I was the least impressive of the lawyers that were advising John Sununu. But I told him he was going to lose. And the others did not. And when he lost, he called me up and said, I'd like you to be my legal counsel. John, I knew nothing about Concord. I knew nothing about the politics of Concord. I was a governor at large in the New Hampshire Bar Association. I assure you at that moment in my life, I wanted to be a trial lawyer, which in those days didn't mean a plaintiff's lawyer. I wanted to try cases. I wanted to be prominent in civic matters. I did not want to be in politics. But I called up my mother, and I knew how elated she was going to be. And I said, Mother, I have some exciting news for you. The newly elected governor has asked me to be legal counsel to the governor. And she said, that's wonderful. She said, you're not going to do it, are you? I said, Mother, why wouldn't I? I mean, the title alone, I didn't know what they did, but the title alone sounded pretty impressive. And I knew that Paul McEachran, a very good lawyer from Portsmouth who was a Democrat, he had been legal counsel to the governor. I said, that can't hurt. Looks good on the resume. She said, I don't want you to be involved in politics. I'm very proud of you being a lawyer at Devine. I think that's what you should do. Eventually, I convinced her that it would be a good thing for me.
That's what my mother would have said too.
Oh, really?
She would have said the same thing. That's
Isn't that
amazing.
interesting?
Isn't that amazing? And so you did that job.
I was legal
I remember
counsel
you
to
were
the governor.
working hour after hour.
It was
after
crazy.
hour.
And the person who told me how crazy it was you, John Broderick. This is what I would do. The job only paid $19,500 because Warren Rudman, when he was Attorney General, said he didn't want anybody really good getting the job. So at $19,500, they weren't going to be any good because they weren't going to challenge him as Attorney General. It was really brilliant. And so I would work at Devine Willamette in the morning. Then I would race up to the State House and be legal counsel to the governor during the day. Then I would come back after the legislature would go home, and I would work at night. And I did that for over a year. I went to visit you, my dear friend, John Broderick, down at the Cape, and you took me to a restaurant, which I still remember, and you explained to me how I couldn't keep doing that. And I was absolutely crestfallen. But by the time I left the dinner, I realized I was killing myself. And I was burning the candle at both ends, and I was going to make a mistake at some point if I wasn't careful. I went back and told the governor that, and he said, I've always said I wouldn't have a chief of staff. Would you be willing to be my chief of staff? And I said, well, only if I can work it out with Devine so that I can work fewer hours and that they consider this a privilege that the chief of staff to the governor is in their law firm. Again, Devine Willamette, a Democratic firm, said to me, a Republican, Joe Willamette, he said, it's a great opportunity, you should do it.
See, what years was Sununu governor?
He was elected in 78. He served in 80, served in 82, served in 85. So he was in the early 80s. He was elected when Reagan was elected. It was in that sweep. So in those early 80s, that's what I was doing.
And how long were you legal counsel and chief of staff?
I was legal counsel for a year. I was chief of staff and legal counsel for another year. And then Greg Smith decided to leave the office of Attorney General. And I was heading for vacation. I took your advice. I was going to go to Baja, California, and actually take the first vacation in years and years and years. And the governor called me on the day I was leaving, and he said, I want you to consider becoming Attorney General. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. And I remember I met with you. And again, it's funny, John, I don't have the confidence that people think I have. People say, you get along in a crowd, you get along at a party. I have to push myself to do it. I'm naturally kind of a loner. I like being alone. I like listening to music, reading, cooking. Those are all solitary things. Mm-hmm. And when he asked me to do it, I didn't have the confidence, but you said to me, it's an extraordinary opportunity. You can't pass it up. And with that kind of courage, I went to see Joe Willamette, who said, well, I was legal counsel for John King, and he never offered me the job, so you should take it, which I thought was a very nice thing to say. And I said, well, aren't you going to be upset, Joe? And he said, how can I be upset? It was such a nice statement to make. He said, I never criticize anybody for doing something in their own best interest. I think this is not only in your best interest, it's in the firm's best interest. It'd be great to interview people and say, hey, the Attorney General is a lawyer here.
Well, I knew you'd do a great job at it, and I knew it wouldn't come twice, and you did. And we're going to take a brief break, and we're going to come back and talk about some of those years there.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Said something in your remarks. I sound like Don Corleone. I do. Hey, what's the problem?
You sound like Don Corleone without the power.
Yeah, once they do the radiation, I'm
It's not a good
That's
thing.
to take the pills.
I hope it doesn't distract
You know
from
what
my
I'm
part
doing
of the
before
interview.
we do that? Let me take an aspirin. Nothing personal.
Oh my gosh, the two were... All right.
Okay. Steve, before we talk about your time as AG, how did you get involved in the New Hampshire Task Force on Child Abuse, which you were very prominent in?
It's interesting, John. I served 8 years on the New Hampshire Task Force Against Child Abuse as their lawyer and then a year as their president. Divine Millimet had a sense of urging people in the firm to do public good, pro bono activities, but not just cases, but to get involved in the community, make the community a better place. I think Joe Millimet had started that and set that standard. And because he represented some people accused of being communist professors in the 50s at the University of New Hampshire. They couldn't afford to pay him, and he did that. One of the reasons my father didn't want me to go to the firm. But when I got the call, would I be interested in this incipient organization called the New Hampshire Task Force Against Child Abuse and Neglect? All of the really prominent lawyers were already either on the Cancer Fund or the Heart Fund or the Chamber. And I honestly thought, there isn't much child abuse and neglect in New Hampshire, if there's any. That's a big city problem, but certainly not here, where the sense of family and sense of community is so important. But I agreed to do it for a year, and I went on there knowing that I was going to vote to keep families intact, because in my view, the state would often come in. Now you got to picture this a long time ago, but in those days, my view was the state would come in and pull kids out. And it was unfair because a nuclear family is the best possible relationship, if you can have one. Not everybody's going to have one. My parents were divorced and I didn't have one. But here's the interesting part, John. In all the years I was on there, I never voted to keep the family together, not even once. Because by the time the cases got to us, they were so outrageous. I was ready to go over and punch somebody in the nose by the time I read the facts. And I couldn't leave the task force, because I found out that New Hampshire, just like every other state, did have problems that we didn't want to acknowledge, and that it wasn't the guy in the pickup truck with a six-pack of beer. It was doctors and lawyers who didn't care anything about their kids. They didn't spend any time with their kids. Their kids were out getting into all kinds of issues. And I thought, I want to do something about this. Maybe I can help kids to have a chance. And so I stayed prominent in that.
You were there for several years, Steve.
I was there for almost 10 years.
Yeah, it's raised its visibility. When I went on the court, I had the same reaction, which is, we can't be child abuse in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
And a third of our cases were felony appeals, and a third of that third were child abuse, sexual assault. It was shocking, really.
To jump ahead for a minute, when I was running for governor, in the 11 months I ran for governor in 1992, I had been the only attorney general in the country to personally try cases. I never got one question about that. All the questions were about child abuse and neglect and why I was involved. And I got nervous about it. And finally, my campaign staff from Washington, which was a fabulous staff, they only did my race because they wanted to do a presidential primary. If I had been in another state, they wouldn't have done my race, because I think they lost money on it. But they said to me, you don't get it, do you? They want to know, people who vote for a governor want to know you got a heart. They know you're a tough prosecutor. They know you're going to balance the budget, even though it's a difficult thing. They want to know you got a heart. That's why they keep asking you about that. It never occurred to me, but that's exactly why they were asking.
Steve, how long were you the AG?
I was the Attorney General from 1982 to 1985.
And who did you follow? Who had been there?
Followed Greg Smith. And I was the first Attorney General since Warren Rudman who had not served in the office. Warren was legal counsel to the governor. I had been legal counsel to the governor. But David Souter, Tom Rath, Greg Smith, they had all served in the office. And I made sure that I proved myself to the office rather than the other way around. I had tried a lot of cases at Divine Millimet. I had been legal counsel to the governor, chief of staff. I don't know that the attorneys in the AG's office were impressed with that. I think they were more afraid that I was going to be a political lawyer and that I wasn't going to call the shots straight. So I made sure that I did what they asked me to do. I said I'd like to try some cases, but I made them pick the cases. So I tried a murder case and got a conviction with a gentleman named Greg Swope, who's a great lawyer, for someone that had drunk more alcohol than anyone who had ever been convicted of murder one before in New Hampshire. And I tried a transportation case that they brought down to me that was supposed to be unwinnable. And I actually argued it in the New Hampshire Supreme Court. And David Souter complimented me afterwards and said, while you were arguing, I was saying, now why didn't I do that as Attorney General? But I wasn't going to run for governor, John. I was going to go back and practice law with you.
How many lawyers there at the time?
Oh, there were 40 lawyers at the time. And it was interesting because knowing about the legislature helped, because I could get through, in fact, in New Hampshire, the task force on child abuse and neglect, we got through prominent child abuse legislation that we never would have gotten before. But I have to tell you a story. The first time I went as Attorney General to testify in the legislature, it was in front of the Judiciary Committee, which was run by Donna Sitek, a prominent woman from Salem. And there was a hearing on...
Who later was Speaker of the House? Speaker
of the House, and a dear friend of mine. But I was nervous because it was my first time as Attorney General testifying. And when I went in the room, it was packed, and there was a woman testifying on rape kits and the importance of rape kits, and she had been a rape victim. And she was doing an adequate job, but she was clearly intimidated, and she wasn't going to carry forth. There was a monetary issue, and she wasn't going to win, I could tell. So they then called me up to testify on another bill. Had nothing to do with that. And I said, I didn't know if I was allowed to do this or not. I said, Madam Chairman, may I take a moment to address the issue that the last witness did? And I started talking about how important it was to have rape kits, that the victims shouldn't have to pay for them. And I felt passionate about it. The woman was still in the room and I could hear her crying.
Wow.
It's a moment I'll never forget. She started weeping because the Attorney General was going to fight for her cause. That was worth doing.
You know, see, the office of Attorney General, I've often thought is the best job for any lawyer in there. It's a great job.
It's a great job.
And it's had some really distinguished people serving it. You mentioned several of them, include yourself in that too. In 1989, you left the AG's office, and you and I started our own law firm.
We started our own law firm. I should tell you, by the way, I should tell you about my first case as Attorney General. There was a terrible homicide, and I refused to give out the documents because it was going to help us convict the people. And my first time in a courtroom as Attorney General, I was a defendant when the union leaders sued me in Carroll County, and I had to drive up and represent myself in Carroll County. Everybody always assumes if you're a Republican, the union leader's on your side. The union leader believes more in disclosure, right to know, First Amendment. They pounded me all the time.
What did you enjoy most about the job, and what surprised you the most about the job?
I enjoyed changing public policy. It was the first time I really thought about if you can be an Attorney General with an agenda on child abuse and neglect or on other criminal justice issues. We had some terrible juvenile crimes, and I fought to change the juvenile laws. I could see that one person could actually make a difference in a state like New Hampshire. That was exciting for me. I wasn't prepared for the criticism. The Concord Monitor in particular never liked anything I did. I think because I worked for Sununu. So they didn't like me, no matter what. There was nothing I could do. And I had to get used to that. But I think the more I was attacked from the outside, the more the lawyers in the AG's office came to say, you know, this guy's okay. He's calling him as he sees him.
You were active in the AG's Association nationally?
I was, and I still am actually. I'm the co-chairman of the Attorneys General Emeritus, but I was very prominent in the National Association of Attorneys General. I still travel. I've always traveled to their meetings, John. I go at least twice a year to their national meetings, and I have great respect for the Attorneys General.
Well, I know when you left, Steve, in '89, nobody noticed that I was leaving, nor much cared that I was leaving the land. But they cared a lot about you leaving the Attorney General's office. I think it was stunning, actually, to a lot of people. Why did you do that?
I felt that it was time for the newly elected Governor, Judd Gregg, to choose his own person to be the Attorney General. And I thought, you know, in a state where people run for office every 2 years, I can't get wedded to any particular job forever. Because if I'm going to be involved in exciting things, and as you know, I'm a risk taker. I've parachuted out of a plane I've went snorkeling 7 miles off the Florida coast with sharks and barracuda, and I rode Brahma bulls in a rodeo for 3 days.
You still have the hematoma.
I still have a blood clot that'll never go away. It was the craziest. I've done some crazy things, but that was one of them. And I got very badly injured, dragged underneath and stepped on by the bull. Not as bad as the New Hampshire legislature did to me on a couple of
Did
occasions.
anyone tell you that might happen before?
Yeah, well, I knew just enough to be dangerous, but a 2,500-pound bull does not have a great deal of concern for who's riding him, I have to say.
And as I recall, he demonstrated that lack of concern.
He did demonstrate that.
Pretty clearly.
When I talked to you about what I should do next, you suggested to me that I couldn't go back in life, we needed to do something new and fresh. And as much as we cared about Divine Millimet, it was our own entrepreneurial venture, which I think Divine understands, because it happens every once in a while. Lawyers say, you know, I love this place, but I got to do my own venture. And we would go to Boston and talk about what we were going to do as a firm. And I remember that although you wanted the firm to be called Merrill and Broderick, I asked you if on the letterhead your name could come first, and you said no. You said you were the Attorney General, and so it should be your name first. I always admired that about you. It was not required at all. I would have gone to Broderick and Merrill, and I would have had your name first on the letterhead. But you thought that having been Attorney General, it was important, and you liked the sound of the name of the firm, ironically. You liked Merrill and Broderick better than you liked Broderick and Merrill. And we were two guys that I think were known then as guys that really loved each other. We loved trying cases together. We worked hard. We gave real value to our clients. And this was going to be exciting. I would wake up in the middle of the night worrying about whether we were going to pay the payroll. And whenever it snowed, I got there early and shoveled the walk. I was the only former Attorney General shoveling the walk, I'm sure. But I never thought that...
When you asked to be paid, there was trouble.
That was true. I didn't even get a tip. But I never thought that the state owed me anything or that the bar owed me anything. I always thought it was the other way around. I've always thought I was very fortunate. A lot of people don't, they weren't able to connect the dots the way you and I were, and our careers have shown it.
And I love those years, Steve, we had there. It seems like it was a long time, but in the look back, it wasn't long at all.
It wasn't long at all, and we talked about trying the case in Wichita, but there was not a kind of case that you and I didn't like. There wasn't an area of the law where we didn't think we could be smart as anybody if we just took the time to do it. And I think that what we really liked is we liked being together and we liked trying cases. And there was a sense that our opponents often felt, which is these guys are having a good time. I can't believe how much they enjoy doing this. And that was always the way we felt.
I remember when you and I were talking about it, and I said, well, how do we describe ourselves? And you said, well, let's not call ourselves litigators because they're different than trial lawyers, which is true. And then I said, well, what's the moniker of the firm? Who are we? And as only you could do, you said, this is who we are. We're a large firm in a small building, which was just the attitude you just described.
We did.
Which, rightly or wrongly, is kind of how we saw ourselves. And so there weren't many of us, but we thought that we were larger than we were.
Yes.
And I think it did help.
I think one of the things about you and me that you wouldn't necessarily know is that we don't take it for granted, and we want to work very hard to achieve whatever it is we're going to achieve. But unlike many people in life, and unlike many lawyers, they don't dare to take a chance. Right. You going on the court, that was a daring proposition. You being the Chief Justice, a daring proposition. With all due respect, my dear friend, you could have done a bad job, and you could be remembered as a judge that really wasn't that popular. I could have been an unpopular Attorney General. Heaven knows I could have been an unpopular governor, and still am in the minds of many. But you have to run that risk. The greatest risk is not taking the risk.
Well, I'll tell you, Steve, when you left, just tell us about that process of leaving to run for governor.
That was very hard, John, because we had just started the firm. I felt I was given a window of opportunity to run. I was in Florida when I turned on the radio, and the radio said, Senator Warren Rudman is retiring and Governor Judd Gregg is going to run for governor. And I remember looking at the radio and I remember thinking, oh my goodness, this is my chance. This is my chance to be governor. And it was scary. I had never really I'd never run for anything, nothing like starting at the top. And I remember that my mentor as an AG, Frank Bellotti, the liberal Democratic Attorney General of Massachusetts, and still one of my dearest friends, he said to me, if you're going to run, announce early, because you're going to scare some people out of the race. So don't take a long time and think about it. Announce and see what happens. And I ended up running against the Senate president, who's a friend of mine now, Ed DuPont, and I ran against Liz Hager, who was the Appropriations Committee chair, both of whom, I remember my campaign staff, they said, they have more money, they have more endorsements, they have more political savvy, they've had races under their belt. How are you going to win this thing? And I remember saying to them, because I'm going to outwork them. The one thing I can promise you is I'm going to outwork them. And on the day of the primary, I beat Ed DuPont in his hometown. I only did it because I outworked him. He got in late, he got in July, I got in April. Well, I ran for governor the way I did everything else, which was with a vengeance. So I had already contacted a number of people that Ed would have picked up, but he waited. And he thought he had to wait because there was a legislative session.
It's funny, Steve, having been at the firm then, and we're a relatively small state, but I'd never seen a campaign like that in the state. And having watched you, you were still trying to practice law and other things. It was amazing what you were doing. You were working. Like when you were counsel in the Sununu.
I know.
You'd been in the morning, you'd be gone all afternoon, you'd be coming in the evening.
Yeah.
I said, how does someone do that?
Joe McQuaid, the publisher of the Union Leader, has referred to me, he doesn't know I know this, but he's referred to me as a driven man, which is interesting because I think most people think of me as easygoing and funny and, but I think I am a driven man. And I remember one weekend they said, the polling shows that your campaign needs an economic plan. So we want you to write it. I'd never even taken an economics class in college. But I took a bunch of documents and I wrote the Merrill plan. I thought it was just as thin as dishwater. It was a big hit. People asked for copies of it. Years later, the national governors asked me to come back and speak on it. I thought, if you guys only knew. I was at Merrill and Broderick throwing this document together. It was...
What was the final tally in the primary that you won?
I got the most votes ever cast for anyone in a primary. And then when I ran for governor, I got the most votes ever cast for governor, even more than Ronald Reagan.
And when you left, you were governor for 4 years.
Yeah.
I think, Steve, part of it is people. I know you pretty well, and so if you don't know you pretty well, it seems effortless. It's like most things in life that seem effortless. There's a lot of effort that goes into it.
Yeah.
And you were so good as the governor and so comfortable with the job, and you were blessed with a sense of humor, which made a big difference.
Helped.
And when you left and decided not to run, I remember you pedaled over because you were under a lot of pressure to run against Bob Smith in the U.S. Senate primary, which you don't have to comment, but I think you would have won. I don't have any doubt about that. And you came over to my house, it was a Sunday morning, you'd never bicycled over in your whole life. So I said, either he's stolen a bicycle, which could be a problem.
Yeah, possible.
Or he's kept a bicycle I'd never seen. That was also disturbing. But we sat on my front porch and you said, I'm not going to run. And I said, you're not going to run for the Senate because you're at 70% favorable.
Yeah.
You said, no, I'm not running for re-election as governor. I could have knocked me over with a feather.
You know what happened, John? The same thing that happened at the University of New Hampshire. Once I made the dean's list in the first semester, I felt an obligation to keep doing it. And once I got elected with such a large number of votes, in the day that George Herbert Walker Bush lost the state. So at 6 o'clock in the morning, I go into Ward 1 in Manchester, and I see the president's name, and then 1/2 inch below his name, I see my name. I said, I'm dead. Because Caspar Weinberger had just been indicted. I could see it all shifting away. Over that weekend, people wouldn't look me in the eye, and I thought it was because they weren't going to vote for me. It was actually because they weren't going to vote for the president, and they didn't want to talk to me about that. It was because it was awkward for them. How about this, John? This is something interesting. Citizens of the state of New Hampshire in 1992 loved President George Herbert Walker Bush, and they wouldn't vote for him because he had said, read my lips, no new taxes, and then he had raised taxes. And for them, they just couldn't tolerate it.
Well, what was amazing, Steve, that night, I was coming home from a radio station in Concord, and you had won the governor's race by a pretty large margin, and Clinton had won. And I thought, Clinton carried New Hampshire. And I thought, Bill Clinton won the state,
I know.
and Steve Merrill won by a huge margin as a Republican candidate. People were obviously making personal choices.
And what you find out in politics is that if they vote in a column, they tend to go down 3 or 4 names in that column before they cross over, if they ever cross over, because they're trying to send a message. They want to send a good, hard message. And we had lost 5 of our 6 banks. We were in economic turmoil. It was a very difficult time. And I was running against the income tax, which in those days people said, well, of course we need an income tax. And my argument is, if we don't have an income tax, businesses will move into the state and we'll make the pie bigger. Let's not cut up the pie more. Let's make the pie bigger, and then we'll do well as a state. And because there were so many tax states around us, that worked. I don't know if I'd been the governor of South Dakota if it would have worked, but I think where I was located in New England, it worked.
New Hampshire advantage.
Oh, gosh.
That phrase. That's your phrase.
That was my phrase, yes. Rob Thompson, the governor's son, and I came up with the New Hampshire advantage. He always says that I was the guy that came up with it, but it's a wonderful phrase, John, because a state that has live free or die on its license plate is obviously a state that sees itself independent. We don't take ourselves seriously, but we take the first in the nation primary seriously. We take our tax status seriously. And I used to say, we need to be an oasis of tax sanity in a desert of higher taxes and higher regulation. The states around us are higher tax, higher regulatory states. New Hampshire is a different model. I know people with $2 million houses in New Hampshire who vote against garbage pickup in their town. They take the garbage to the dump every week. That's it. You know, who else but in New Hampshire would you do that? Oh, we're not going to pay for a town to have garbage pickup. That's unnecessary. And the New Hampshire advantage is best exemplified by the following. When I was governor, we received the finest road repair and plowing in the country. And I called up the head of the Department of Transportation. I said, that's a great award. It's just amazing. And he said, you know, Governor, everybody has their own section of highway to plow. And I will call up people and say, the snow has reached a sufficient level. You need to go out there and plow. And he said, invariably, the wife will answer the phone. And she'll say, oh, he's been out there already for an hour. He's been out there for 45 minutes. And I say, well, why is he out already? He's not going to be paid for it. Well, because that's his section of highway. And in some cases, that was his dad's section of highway. He doesn't want accidents in that. It's such a charming, bucolic story, but it's what New Hampshire's all about.
Hey, I want to ask you this, because I was there. I was very proud. I had my best friend sworn in as governor, even if he was misguided as a Republican. It was still exciting. Don't get me wrong.
That may be redundant. But
don't get me wrong, but it was very moving that day. And your remarks that day were eloquent. It was a cold winter day, and snow was pretty deep. And you talked about your mother at the end of the speech. Do you remember the context?
I do. I was able to grant my mother's last wish, which was she wanted to die in my house and not in a hospital. And it seems like an odd request, but it was such a wonderful request to say, of course, Mother, you can come home with me. And that's what she wanted. And so I was able to fulfill that wish. She did not want me to run for governor. She did not want me to get any deeper in politics. And she just wanted me to be a trial lawyer. And I remember at the end of my remarks, I said, and now on this cold, snowy day, I leave this state house as the newly elected governor of New Hampshire, and I will drive to the cemetery in Hampton, where my mother is buried, because between you and me, I think I've got a lot of explaining to do. and everybody roared, thank goodness. And it was true. I did go over there, and I visited her grave often. And it's interesting. I think she was so proud that I had done what I had done as Attorney General. But she was also, as your mom was, she didn't want you to get hurt. She didn't want you to be pushed into an area where bad things could happen. And that was my mom's wish for me.
It was a very touching moment. Let me ask you, Steve, as you look back on your 4 years, and that's a very non-political comment, if you had decided to run again after 4 years, you would have been reelected. I think you would have been reelected without spending a dime, to be very honest. You were very well known, very well liked. You were at 70% favorable, but you stepped down. When you look back on those 4 years, what stands out in a good way and what stands out maybe in a little less favorable light?
When I was elected, unemployment was 8.3, and when I left, it was 3.8. So my goal was to drive jobs into the state, to prove that we didn't need an income tax to do that. And a lot of people in New Hampshire believe that we're not going to be a mature state, an adult state, until we have an income tax. The problem with that argument is no state has ever passed an income tax and then lowered property taxes. What happens is they take all the money in the legislature and they spend it anyway, just like the federal government. They want more money, they're going to spend it. And so I think making the New Hampshire advantage real was something I will always be proud of. The other side, John, is that in order to do it, I drove myself very hard. Never took a vacation, never went skiing. When I look back at it, I would do 3 or 4 events before I went to work in Concord. I'd do an event at lunch, and then I'd do 3 or 4 events before I went home. I never, in the 4 years I was governor, in the 2 terms, I never had dinner at home more than 3 nights in a row. I was always out. And I started a family very late in life. I was 47. I was 47 when I ran for governor for the first time and started a family for the first time, so I have to be certifiably insane. I did both at the same time, but my kids were 3 and 1, and they would cry every time I would leave because I had just gotten home. And I loved being governor, but I also thought, I have an obligation to these kids, and I'd better spend some time with them. And I had seen political families where they didn't spend any time with their kids. And if I had been 25, John, I wouldn't have been that mature. I would have said, they'll be fine. But at 47, I thought, I better spend some time with my kids.
Because it was stunning when you announced it. I mean, it was stunning.
You know what it was? I almost, it sounds awkward. I had to give myself permission not to run. Because you don't think anybody's going to do as good a job or work as hard. And I had people very angry at me. I had Republicans say terrible things about me because I didn't run, because they just assumed that my life was their life. And that's the dilemma of public life.
Tell us what you're doing now. I mean, and before we do that, Steve, when you were governor of the state, I know this much. You were the head of the New England governors for a while, and you were very prominent in the National Republican Governors Association, too.
Yes, if I had run again, they wanted me to be the head of the Republican governors for the country, which sounds amazing even to say it. One of the experiences I had as governor, my boys bought me a radio that you could turn on in the shower, and it was protected. And I would get in the shower every day and turn the radio on, and I would hear about all the things I was going to do during the day. I was exhausted by the time I got out of the shower. I thought, no wonder they don't show me the schedule. That's just too much for any human being to do. But it's exciting to connect with people, and I love that part of it. And when I stepped out of office, a firm that was then called Bingham, Dana and Gould in Boston, the managing partner contacted me and said, you keep talking about power going back to the states. You think since Ronald Reagan more and more power has gone back to the states, and that the state attorneys general are very significant. If that's true, would you like to come here and start something called Bingham Consulting Group and go out and represent companies that are investigated or sued by state attorneys general or governors? So I thought, well, what a great opportunity I can see my friends who are still in the office, and I can perhaps represent some exciting businesses that are in trouble. And when I went to the firm, there were 250 lawyers, and I told the managing partner that I couldn't stay more than 5 years because the firm was too large. I've been there 11 years. It's now 1,200 lawyers. But they're very nice to me. And what I do, I represented Bridgestone Firestone in the tread separation cases. I represent Google. I represent United Health Group. We represented a number of large pharmaceuticals. And they have a Washington strategy, John, but they don't have a strategy to deal with the state attorneys general, who since Microsoft and Big Tobacco are very powerful. If 30 or 40 attorneys general gather together and they attack your company, you're in big trouble. And so what I do is I mediate and resolve those matters and try to keep my clients from fighting with the attorneys general, which is a bad idea. I always say to them, don't fight with people that are both politicians and lawyers because they like to fight. Don't fight with people who like to fight. So I have to calm the companies down and then engage in some negotiations.
Let me ask you something. As someone who's been pretty successful, obviously, in private practice, and very successful in public service, somebody may be watching this tape who's a young lawyer or even younger, looking and wondering whether public service is something they should do, because these are different times.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for them?
It's interesting. When the best thing I ever did was try cases in front of a jury. It was that first time I had that personal connection, that sense of advocacy. The best thing that ever happened as a trial lawyer was practicing with you. The relationship that we have, we are better together than we are apart. You've always given me wonderful advice. You've been such a friend and mentor to me. It was actually difficult for me to go into public life because as a Democrat, I could ask your advice and you always gave me great advice, but we weren't working together on a daily basis. I believe, unlike my parents who didn't want me to get sullied by political life, I believe that for lawyers and for actually anybody who really cares about the state, if the bug of public life hits, you should pursue it, because New Hampshire is a state where you can make a real difference. It isn't like New York, California, where you need to be prominent and powerful and wealthy. If you work hard and get known, you can make a real difference in the state. And I hope I made some difference.
I think you did. And proud to have you as my friend. And I forget that there's a tape rolling. I feel like I'm in my living room, kind of reliving common memories. But
That's great.
Fabulous time. Thanks, Steve, for the time.
My pleasure. Thanks, John.